If you're a parent of a youth sports athlete and not sure how to structure your athlete's training in the off season or in the in season, this video is for you. So generally speaking, when we think about a sports calendar or a sports year, we will have an off season, which will lead into a preseason, and then we'll have our in season actual competition, and then this transition phase, which is typically about 1 to 2 weeks. Now, generally speaking, from a training perspective, off season is where the bulk of our work will be done. This is where athletes are training 3 times a week, 4 times a week, really focusing on building that strength, building that durability, really helping with that injury prevention. In that preseason phase, this is where training kind of changes slightly, in that now we're trying to not move as much load. The intensity is pulled back a little bit, and from a training perspective, we're really trying to work on that power output, trying to get what we built in the weight room, built in the training facilities to the field. Now this kind of tends to be a little more sport specific as well. This is where practice and kind of that preseason practice intensifies, and athletes are getting on the field and courts more often. Obviously, we have that in-season phase where now we're competing in the sport, practicing, and then that transition. It's about 1 to 2 weeks after a season before we lead into the next off season or whatever else is going on. Now, in today's world, this kind of cycle and plan has changed slightly, in that we go from this in-season phase. Generally, most athletes have about a 1 to 2 week transition phase, but then we go into this in-season, what we're calling extension phase, where this is more of your AAU basketball, travel soccer, travel baseball, those sorts of sports. And then once that's done, after a handful of months, then it leads right back into the preseason, and then next back into that in-season. So kind of that off-season period is less and less for athletes these days. And just from a training perspective and trying to prepare their bodies physically for their sport, I think this is why you see a lot of athletes now that are getting burnt out. Many are getting, muscle strains, ACL tears, shoulder problems, these kind of minor injuries that keep popping up. It's really from just a lack of training and a lack of preparing an athlete's body, for the demands of a sport. The thing that I always try to keep in mind is that when we play a sport, it's very intense, it's very violent. It takes a lot on the body. It puts a lot of pressure and force and stress on the body. And if the body's not able to handle that stress and that load and that volume, that's why you see these injuries. It's this body's way of telling us, hey, this is too much. I can't handle it. We need to change some things up. We need to try something different. But since this is kind of the world that we live in, we need to prepare, and we need to be ready to go when these competition periods are going on. So from a training perspective, 100% athletes should be training in season, out of season, just as it relates to thinking about how do I prepare my body to handle the demands, the volume, the intensity, and the stress that my sport is placing on me. From an in-season perspective, I think athletes should be trained at least twice a week. It's not convenient. It's not easy. However, if an athlete wants to play a sport and wants to be successful in a sport, that's kind of what it is. Just from a anatomical perspective, kind of the reason why we stick to 2 days is when we think about how often or how long our adaptations, from a strength perspective, from a speed perspective, from a power perspective, how long those adaptations stick with us. That's why we try to stick to those 2 days. Generally speaking, we have about 7 days worth where if we worked on speed, we'll kind of keep that speed that we've built for 7 days. Once, we go past those 7 days and we're not working on it, we'll lose it. From a strength perspective, it's generally, depending on what type of strength, generally about 30 days, plus or minus, is how often or how long we can keep strength before we start losing it as well. So from an in-season perspective, we're trying to train twice a week. Those would look like 2 full body sessions. It would look like including sprints, including power training, plyometrics, really trying to touch all our qualities. It would be less volume, however, it would be higher intensity. From that, when we go to that transition period, kind of the same idea. We want to keep that training. Maybe we go to once a week, kind of let the body just recover. We'll get stimulus on the body so that we can get some adaptation. Once we go into that in-season extension phase, fall baseball, AAU basketball in the spring and the summer. I think a lot of athletes here think that, this is covering their sport training, that this is getting them better for their sport. And, certainly to a certain extent it is. However, it's just still more stress on the body, more load on the body, more intensity on the body. And so we want to make sure that our body is maintaining that durability throughout it. So yes, we should still be training in this. It's not a time just to focus on the sport. We need to keep training. And it's the same idea. We're looking to maintain strength. We're looking to maintain that durability, working some injury prevention work, still hit sprints, still hit that plyometric, trying to be as athletic as we can, so that when we go into that preseason phase, kind of keeping the same mentality. Now we can kind of dial back some intensity a little bit. Like I said, we kind of move more towards working on power training, trying to get all that strength that's been accumulating in the weight room, transition that and apply that to the sport and to the field. And then the in-season phase, 100% still should be lifting in season. Sometimes it might look like once a week, sometimes it might look like twice a week. Just depends on kind of how the schedule plays out and when games fall and practices fall. But just because athletes are practicing, on this day and that day, twice a week, 3 times a week, we still think that training should happen, whether that's on the same day as practice, whether that's before practice, after practice. There's ways to structure a workout around practice. We think about different training variables, what we're trying to hit, what we're trying to prioritize, what's going to create the least amount of muscular fatigue. However, it's going to train our central nervous system the most to make sure we're still getting some sort of adaptation going. And then, you can take into consideration and factor in when games are playing, how often and how late after you should be, training leading up to a game. There's all those sorts of factors, but the whole idea and the whole premise is that athletes still should be training through that. I appreciate you taking the time to watch this video. The last point that I want to leave you with is that training really is what prepares the body to handle the demand of a sport. It will place the athlete in a much better position to be more healthy, to be successful, to go out and really try to separate themselves, on their respected athletic competition court or field. And if we keep following this cycle where the body is not prioritized, it's not, getting improved on and getting better, we're going to keep seeing burnout rates with athletes increase. We're going to still keep seeing these injuries keep reoccurring, probably see even more injuries in different ways and in different parts of the body. So we're big time believers in that training is what helps these athletes stay healthy, stay on the court, and be successful in whatever sport that they're playing.